One of the most important things to remember about India is its role in establishing a number of religious faiths. You're probably familiar with Hinduism, but Buddhism also gets its start in India, as does Jainism. And of course, later, there is in India a period of coexistence between Hindus and Muslims. That's that, that's later than that comes centuries after where we begin this lecture. Really, when we're talking about the beginning of religious tradition in India, we generally date it to the beginning to the establishment of the Vedas. Um, these are sometimes understood as hymns. Um, they are associated with the Aryan invasion of India. So the Aryans, who you remember from the other lecture, are a nomadic people who come sweeping into northern India approximately about 1500 BC. So it's not a one event, it's a gradual event, right? And they bring with them a certain religious tradition we know as we call the Vedas, the Rig Vedas sometimes. These later are developed in the Upanishads, which is more elaborate religious text that very closely associated. But we're having the beginning of what later becomes Hinduism, but it's really a sort of a proto-Hinduism. That is, it's the beginnings of it. It's not Hinduism as it is practiced today necessarily. Hinduism, I think we should understand, is a very broad religion, just like Christianity is, right? A Methodist calls herself Christian, as does a Unitarian, as does a Catholic, and yet they have very different religious services, very different religious expressions. Some of these concepts, though, that are developed in Hinduism, proto-Hinduism, I'll call it, and are also reflected in other traditions such as Buddhism, such as Jainism, samsara, moksha, and karma. And you might be familiar with some of the people. You hear sometimes people talk about bad karma. Well, the idea of sometimes understood as a cause and effect, the law of cosmic of cause and effect, sometimes understood as a what must be done, what must happen. Samsara is often held as sometimes described as a world of illusion, that the world of phenomena, the body you have, the material world, that might be the easiest way to think of it, as opposed to a spiritual world. It's something that is beyond the material. The system of classifications that are often associated with Hinduism, they find their early expression in what is called the laws of Manu, which is establishes different and codifies different relationships. You might regard them as being, they might rub you the wrong way, as being unequal. This is obviously a patriarchal culture at this point. So the women are anything but the equal in status to men. Um, Later, of course, we have the concept of Varna, which is also developed with this sometimes understood that this is something that the Aryan invasion brings. And if you think about it, it kind of makes sense because you have the invaders looking to separate themselves from the people that they have invaded and subjugate those who are invaded. So you have this establishment of different classifications. Um, I mentioned you have these concepts that are developed prior to Buddhism, and Buddhism you can kind of understand as almost an attempt to reform the proto Hinduism of the time. So with Brahmanism or Vedic religious practices, we associate these concepts of samsara dharma, which is sometimes understood as the law, and karma, this cause and effect. Within Jainism, which is was not a very large number of practitioners, but influential in its own way, and is developing about the same time that Buddhism is developing in India. You have the concept of ahimsa, nonviolence, and also moksha, which is liberation from the self. Jainism is much more ascetic. That is, it rejects any sort of material comfort, even to the extent of the most extreme level followers of this religion dispensed with clothes and walked around and were naked. So this is that could present its own problems, but very in some ways very much about purification of the flesh. So Buddhism begins with an actual historic figure. We have some information that documents his birth and death, and his story. Some of it is shrouded in call it myth or legend, but the story is that he was born into a small kingdom. He is a prince, and before he is born, there is a prediction made that he will be either a a famous saint of sorts, or a wise man, or else a great conquering hero. And his father obviously wants him to be stay in the worldly world. So he constructs an environment where his son, Siddhartha Gautama, has everything he wants, all the earthly pleasures that a person can have. Nonetheless, he, legend has it, he is able to be escorted 3 times outside of the grounds of the palace. And on one, actually, it might be 4 times when I think about it, he sees a sick person, then he sees someone who is old, and he asks his coachman, "What is this? Why does that person look different?" And he said, "This is the nature of all existence. That we age, people get old, and we get sick." And finally, he sees a corpse by the side of the road, and he said, "What is this?" And I said, "This is the nature of mortality. We die." And finally, he sees a religious beggar by the road. He said, "What is that person doing?" And his escort says, "This is a religious mendicant. This is a holy man who has renounced the world in order to seek the truth." And Siddhartha Gautama resolves to follow that path, and he does follow that path. He, as I mentioned, this sort of ascetic trend that existed at the time, this idea of mortifying the flesh, would somehow bring someone closer to God. And so Siddhartha Gautama attempts that and nearly starves himself to death. And according to legend, a deity in the form of a milkmaid comes by, and Siddhartha Gautama has a flash of insight when he recognizes that this asceticism, starving himself to death, is not going to, in fact, make him more holy. And he accepts nourishment from the milkmaid. And the people that he had been traveling with, other would-be holy men, are outraged by this, but nonetheless he resolves to continue on his path to seek enlightenment, and he resolves to sit in meditation, deep meditation, until he does become enlightened. And the story is he does in fact have this flash of enlightenment that comes to him as basically the structure, which later forms the structure of Buddhism. The Buddhism is structured in some very simple, numerical things. The Four Noble Truths that sometimes there's different interpretations, but suffering is real. Craving causes suffering. Cessation of craving stops suffering, and following the Eightfold Path is the method for stopping craving and suffering. As I said, there are different interpretations. Life is challenging. The cause of suffering is the mind struggle in response to the challenge. It is possible to end suffering, and finally, that there is this Eightfold Path that will lead a person to that place. And there is this establishment of an Eightfold Path, which involves different elements, such as right livelihood and right speech, right action, which lend themselves to, you can read entire religious books to analyze these, but that's the basis, of most fundamental basis of Buddhism. When Buddhism is established, it actually spreads quite quickly in India. There are some things that are quite attractive. For one thing, it rejects this concept of varna, this, or sometimes what is called in the Western word for it is caste. This idea of separating people by social backgrounds. In later years, Hinduism becomes more popular, and Buddhism spreads throughout Asia, spreads north over via Tibet and into China, and then also through the south, through Ceylon. But in India, it more or less becomes, it is supplanted by this sort of refashioned Hinduism. Of course, as we mentioned in the other lecture, the fact that there were some very powerful Indian kings who were Buddhist and supported the religion, that helped quite a bit. One of the things you have to know about Buddhism is that there is this split between Theravada and Mahayana Buddhism. Theravada is sometimes translated as the way of the elders. The whereas Mahayana is the the greater vehicle, the larger path. Mahayana is more there's more diversity within Mahayana than there is in Theravada. Theravada also they have geographical differences. Theravada tends to be more in um, Southeast Asia when you're talking about Ceylon, for example, or Sri Lanka, today's Sri Lanka, um, Burma. That Buddhism there generally follows more of the Theravada tradition. Mahayana, we're talking about um, the Buddhism that goes to China, the Chan Buddhism, and then the Buddhism in Japan and Korea, Zen Buddhism. That's all Mahayana. Oops. One of the concepts that is in Mahayana Buddhism and not in Theravada Buddhism is the concept of the Bodhisattva, which this is not strictly accurate, but you might think of it as in some way similar to a saint. It is a being that has foregone ultimate nirvana for the sake of helping other people achieve enlightenment. So this selfless um, aspiration to help all others on the path to enlightenment. So when you have a bodhisattva vow, that's what is being talked about. As I mentioned, um, after Ashoka and a few subsequent emperors, Hinduism is a resurgence of Hinduism. In some ways, Hinduism is this has this celebration of earthly pleasures that is quite attractive. Um, more whereas Buddhism is very focused on existential spiritual questions that frankly sometimes are more than most people want to tangle with.